Hello and happy Monday to everyone. Want to welcome everyone to our webinar today on ransomware, and want to thank you for joining us today. I know there's during this time webinar and virtual meeting overload, so I really appreciate the time that you've invested to join me today through this webinar, and I hope that you find some valuable information here that will help protect you and your organization from this prevailing threat of ransomware that we see dominating the landscape today. There is a questions button in the presentation here that you can ask questions. I'll be getting to those at the end of the session, so we'll have some time to go through those questions. And any that we don't get to, I can respond to offline as well. This webinar will be offered on demand at the same link that you're at now, so if you want to come back and revisit any of this information, then you're free to do so after we get done with the webinar. Also, you'll see an attachments link under the presentation that gives you access to some data, some slicks about OneSource communications, and even a promo code for a free threat assessment if you're interested in looking at that information or being a part of that free threat assessment. So today we're going to be discussing ransomware and the many delivery methods and recent changes in methodologies that threat actors are using today to deliver these destructive payloads. So let's get started and go through the information I've put together for you today. So a little information about myself. My name is Steve Cobb. I'm the CISO of OneSource. OneSource is headquartered in North Carolina. We've got offices in Alabama, Tennessee, and Oregon. We've been in business 25 plus years. We offer managed services around communication lifecycle management, managed IT services, and managed security services to our global clients. We have two security operations centers located in the U.S. They operate 24/7 by 365 and provide managed security services to our clients, both from a operational and strategic standpoint. So hopefully you've heard about ransomware. I'm sure that you've had. Ransomware is essentially the COVID-19 of the digital world, if you will. As attackers discover that there are a multitude of easy targets out in the landscape, both domestically in the U.S. and globally across the world. And they also learn that the return on investment is extremely high based on the amount of effort that's put forward. These attempts of spreading ransomware are increasingly daily. So as you can see from this slide, we consider it a remote digital shakedown, destructive, it's expensive. We see it affecting all types of organizations, not just one specific vertical. Let's talk a little bit about some of the new strategies and tactics that cyber criminals are using today. And first, here, let's just talk a little bit about some of the numbers that we have here. Obviously, the pandemic's just adding fuel to the cybersecurity fire, if you will. And some of these are recent stats that we'll see as we go through this webinar that are on the rise. Some of those are directly related to the pandemic. Some of them are directly related to the organization and sophistication of the attackers and them being able to become more efficient and more effective at how they are attacking your networks or anyone's networks that are available out in the environments. So threat actors are being opportunistic on how they interact with an environment once they've reached it. So for instance, they might try to automatically move to automated deployment of ransomware. We've seen that happen. Or depending on the environment, if it's more complex, or maybe the environment they're in, they realize has more attractive targets, maybe along the lines of information that will be higher value around intellectual property, or maybe other items of data that they tend to think are more valuable. They may dwell in the environment longer and see how they can gain access to all those other particularly high-valued data targets that they now have access to. So as we see as well, attackers are now offering discounts for paying the ransom sooner. So this is another tactic that's evolved for attackers, that when they ransomware a business, typically, they would have a note there about collecting the ransom and having the organization contact them. Now we're even seeing them negotiate with with organizations to speed up the payment process and offering discounts if ransoms are paid, let's say, within 24 hours or 48 hours of the incident. You also see a rise of companies now that do the negotiation on behalf of clients to try to lower the ransom cost from the threat actors. Attackers are also utilizing more complex tools and they're exfiltrating data in order to shame or extort ransom payments with the threat of publishing that private data. So we see this increasingly more and more in the environment where attackers are using multiple avenues to try to extort organizations and gain money, revenue from those by any method possible. Even, as I said, publishing that data and requiring ransom to get that data down off the internet or off the public access for the world. We do see also an increase in what we would call living off the land, attackers using not homegrown, but available tools that are administrative tools that many use in their own environments to manage and administer their environments to then further their attacks. So using things like PowerShell, other tools that are readily available and often used legitimately are being manipulated and using to help obfuscate their movements in the environments and lower the alarm or criticality of alerts that maybe do get fired so that internal organizations believe these are routine operations when really it's the threat actors moving or doing reconnaissance. Obviously, all highly available organizations are becoming targets. State and local governments are huge targets. You've seen that more and more. Hospitals, anyone who has the ability to pay, or even if they don't have the ability to pay, they're non-discriminate, these attackers are, to go after those people because they have highly available networks and their data is very valuable to them. Now, as I said earlier, duration and movement towards deployment of payloads varies. Several reports show that the dwell time is the lowest it has ever been overall. But they're still extremely long dwell times in many cases where ransomware is ultimately deployed. So we see the escalations of deployment in real world and honeypot instances occurring sometimes within 24 to 48 hours. A lot of that seems to be tied to the environment itself, how complex it is, what chances the attackers think they have from success and getting payment. Sometimes they may act sooner rather than later. And sometimes, as I mentioned before, they may dwell to see what other highly valuable data and targets they can discover and then compromise in order to increase their payout from the ransom. Some of the most common methods of ransomware infections that we see, and this is looking at specifically in the U.S., by far, spam and phishing emails still hold 67% of what we've seen in most methods. But what I'd like you to notice here, these other methods have increased from previous statistics. So predominantly in the past, ransomware was delivered via phishing emails. Users would click on links, malware would be deployed that would then ultimately deploy the ransomware in the environments. We're seeing other methods of compromise that are happening now and going up, all follow along the line, a lot of times of user practices, security awareness for those users, but then also configurations and the maturity that an organization's IT environment and IT staff have to facilitate solutions that may be provided for, let's say in the pandemic case, better convenience, better remote access. Sometimes those specific solutions may have vulnerabilities or may not be, may be misconfigured such that it opens the door for these threat actors to gain a foothold, an initial compromise spot within these environments. So let's dive a little bit deeper into some of the methodologies and things that we see going on in ransomware attacks today. So most common initial vectors we see right now on the rise is remote desktop protocol. If you're not familiar with remote desktop protocol, it's a built-in utility within Microsoft Windows to allow you to remotely access a workstation or server and perform maybe administrative duties. In many cases, people use this methodology to remote to their work computers in order to perform work while they're remotely at home or traveling, whatever the case may be. We're seeing a huge increase in remote desktop in RDP exploitation. We still have those methods of phishing with a link. So a significant number of attacks that we've seen lately are linked to phishing campaigns using some of the most common, well-known malware that you can think about. A lot of those geared toward financially motivated operations. But for instance, we see a lot of emotet infections and TrickBot infections that ultimately turn into ransomware deployment. So what that tells us is these threat actors, these groups that are getting initial compromise into environments, in many cases are then selling access into that environment to other threat groups who will come in and deploy the ransomware and go through the process of extorting money from these organizations. I'll say again for RDP, a lot of times what we'll see is attacks against, let's say, an administrator account or an account where failed logins is not locked out via Active Directory or group policy enforcement. And so you'll see a tremendous amount of brute force credentials, then failed attempts, if you will, and then finally a successful one. So in other cases, we'll see successful RDP logon was the first evidence of malicious activity prior to the ransomware infection. And it is possible that targeted systems had default or weak credentials, or the attacker acquired those credentials via other means, either other computers that were openly available, or they've some other way acquired those credentials, maybe even purchased those on the dark web, as I mentioned a minute ago about the emotet and TrickBot actors. We also see drive-by downloads that continue to occur where we can trace ransomware infections back to a user that visits a environment, a website, for instance, that has Dridex loaded or a web shell loaded on the system. And so when the victim visits those compromised environments, then they become compromised themselves. Now, the number of days that we talk about the escalation of the deployment of ransomware has gone down dramatically, as I mentioned before. So there's still a good chance, though, that if you have the right tools and protections in place, that if you can detect and remediate the initial compromise quickly, you can save yourself from the ultimate goal from the threat actor's standpoint of ransomware deployment. But typically, you can see from this slide, we're saying 3 days passing between the first evidence of malicious activity and the deployment of ransomware. We have seen that in environments, as I mentioned before, as little as 24 to 48 hours. And so it really depends ultimately on the attacker group that is targeting you and the methodologies they use. Regardless of it, still does stand true no matter what, that if you have the correct or the appropriate tools or methodologies in place, detecting these malicious activity as soon as possible will allow you to combat the deployment, the escalation to deployment of ransomware in your environment. The other thing that we see here is the origin, if you will, of these attacks and where they come from, the source countries. This slide and the next slide will speak to the idea that typically the initial compromise is initiated from outside the U.S. So it's from other countries that are on different time zones. And when we consider work hours for the U.S., a lot of those other countries are on their work schedules because they're a different time zone than the U.S. when U.S. organizations are closed or not doing normal work hours. And from this slide, you can see the same thing holds true with the by hour, the amount of ransomware deployed. Yes, there is still ransomware deployed during work hours, but predominantly the majority of it is deployed in what we would call after hours. We also see a tremendous number of spike in ransomware deployment on days like weekends or holidays. And you can most definitely understand there what the methodology for the attackers is. They're trying to execute their ransomware or deliver their payloads during times when organizations may be offline. They may be not have support or resources available during those hours, and they essentially have free reign across the environment to deploy the ransomware, troubleshoot issues they have, and then go through with the full successful exploitation. We ourselves at OneSource responded to a few incidents recently that occurred over the Memorial Day holidays. So holidays are a big time when we see attackers launch their escalation of deployment of ransomware because just of those factors. When they can get access to those things without the threat of somebody being at a screen watching alerts, they see themselves become much more successful. We had a recent incident where we saw the attackers get in an environment for a client we came in to do the incident response for, and the attackers had issues deploying the ransomware. We could see the steps where they troubleshooted that ransomware deployment until they got it right and were able to deploy the ransomware. So it just goes to show that as the attackers get in an environment and it's after hours, they can do all they want to change their methodology or find the most effective way to deploy the ransomware such that it has the greatest impact, and therefore they can extort the greatest amount of payday revenue, if you will, from their targets. And for most of these attacks, we consider ransomware attacks an advanced attack. So what does that mean? That's an attack where there is a human at the keyboard. They are doing reconnaissance to see how much damage they can inflict. So for instance, they're looking for your backup operations, how you're doing backups. If they can find those, they delete them. We see attackers get in environments and do reconnaissance and try to find network storage appliances or storage networks, whatever they can to facilitate deleting that backup data. Then it directly increases the amount of damage that an organization would feel from the attack, and therefore more likely that the attackers get their ransom payments, and even in a more timely manner, because organizations can't fall back to backups, or they can't revert back to past history on the systems because they've been deleted. We also see attackers scraping as many credentials as they can, and you quickly see them pivot and try to use those credentials in other areas, popular cloud platforms. So if you think about Office 365 or Salesforce or ADP or any of those kind of places where once the attackers have credentials, they go and try to see how they can expand their operations and inflict more and more damage. They have very specific objectives. They may be long or short-term goals, as mentioned. And then most of the time, if they're going to dwell for a longer period of time, they'll have some type of persistence tools to make sure they can access the network when they are ready to escalate to the deployment of ransomware. Also, typically, once you've been compromised, you're going to always be a target. So more than likely, if you've been compromised, your data has been advertised on the dark web. Attackers in these communities, they try and revisit those targets that were accessible before, because typically that means that they may not have good security hygiene. They may not be practicing the right type of change management or risk management in their environments. And typically it makes them an easy target. So if a new vulnerability is released, they feel like those people who've been successfully targeted in the past are slower to remediate against those vulnerabilities. And so therefore they revisit those. You can see here that our customers who had a significant attack, they were attacked again by the same or similarly motivated group. Once again, 49% who were attacked at least one significant time were successfully attacked again within 1 year. So the percentages go up exponentially on an organization once they have been successfully compromised and ransomware has been deployed, because those attackers want to try to revisit those environments frequently and see if they can continue to extort money from those organizations. So let's talk about a little bit of the trends of the future for ransomware. Ransomware is ever changing, and as these attackers try to increase their return on investment, their time that they put in, how quickly they can turn those things around, how they can be more effective, how they can make it more automated, they're going through changes, just like any business that you consider. And these are people that are treating this as a business, a criminal enterprise. They're looking to expand their businesses as much as possible. When we look at right now, the 2019 digital ransom per incident average, it went up from $5,900 in 2019 to $8,100 in 2020. And you consider that more than likely a small sum of money, but then you have to think about this is the average, and there are ransoms that were in the millions of dollars or multi-millions of dollars. Many times these in these smaller environments that attackers think they get a lower payout, they'll try to do as much automated as possible, and sometimes there won't be hands-on keyboards. It really does depend on the environment and how much the attackers can discover about the environment, so they can determine on how highly valuable the data they'll have access to will be. The average cost of the ransomware caused downtime per incident has gone up from $141,000 to $283,000. A lot of that has to do around, once again, the breadth of the operations that attackers do. So they're targeting more things now to try to extort more money. So in the past, they may have been targeting just servers. Now they target all appliances, servers, workstations, anything they can do to inflict damage on environments. As you can imagine, attackers are determining that if they can ransomware, let's say the CEO's or the CFO's laptop, many times there's considerable amount of impact there to the business overall, and organizations are more willing to pay sometimes for the CEO's laptop to be unencrypted than even some of their servers. That also speaks to sometimes what the recovery and backup, disaster recovery, and business continuity strategy and plans are around your entire organization and network, and how you adjust for that depending on what an attacker may gain access to. So we see the phishing attacks are up 667% since the pandemic began. So the continued pandemic is definitely an opportunity for evil to thrive. And you see this even from the lures that are sending phishing emails now that are around time off requests, specific remote work, COVID-19, governmental forms, or governmental rules and regulations. Attackers are using those because they're common. And they also sow the idea of fear and anxiety to users. So users are more likely to click on those and follow those links in a phishing email during this time. So tremendous uptick there. As I mentioned before, RDP attacks are on the rise. A lot of that due to transition to remote working. We've seen the daily RDP attacks go from 40,000 in December up to over 100,000 in May. And as you look out in environments like Shodan and other places that look for remote vulnerabilities, these numbers increase continually. This is a continuous population of targets for attackers, because not only as new businesses come online, but as business continue to be under the pressure of COVID-19 and the pandemic, and remote work first forces IT departments to provide solutions for remote work. Sometimes those solutions are are looked at in the lens of convenience more so than security. And so when those solutions are put in place, they may not be secured properly. They may be opened to public internet where they shouldn't be. But RDP is being exploited heavily by threat actors. We'll talk about that a little bit more, of things that you need to look at from an RDP standpoint, and how if you're going to do that solution, there's definitely some security controls that you should put in place. My recommendation would be, and most that you would see on the internet from anyone, whereas RDP probably is not the best solution for you, even for small businesses, to provide remote access to users. So those are things where you can talk to your IT teams and your security teams and get a better understanding of what the business functionality is needed and how you can provide that in a secure way so it does not impact the business adversely. We see attackers that are coupling ransomware deployment with other tactics. As I mentioned before, exfiltration of data, so they can get that data out on the internet and either shame or extort money for it. So this data theft is only going to continue. What we see for instance that we responded to is not only are attackers getting in environments and starting reconnaissance to see what's available on the network, they're immediately starting to get data that they have access to exfiltrated out of the environment so they can leverage that on the dark web. They can leverage that as an extortion scheme to the client that they're pulling data from, or the organization they're pulling data from. We're also seeing many of the ransomware gangs collaborating and putting together auction sites. So it's one of the big trends that's happening now is these ransomware groups are auctioning off the data they've exfiltrated from their ransomware events, so that they can make, if the organization who had the data didn't pay, they can auction it off to the highest bidder. So imagine let's take for instance a law firm that has data exfiltrated, and the law firm feels like their backup, their disaster recovery plans and strategies are in good enough shape that they don't need to pay the ransom, they can get their data back. That data could be valuable to a competing law firm, or maybe clients of that law firm who have information around intellectual property, sexual harassment suits, anything like that today that could be utilized to then damage that company or extort money in some way from even another organization. We're gonna continue to see this evolve as attackers try to maximize the impact and maximize payouts that they get from their ransomware operations. Cloud services are now holding more and more critical data. As I mentioned before, you can consider cloud operators like Microsoft, Google, Amazon, things like APT, where people have their workforce management in the cloud, payroll, those sorts of things. Even things like Salesforce and other specific products that are utilized for organizations that hold critical data. Those more and more are being targeted, and cloud services are really difficult a lot of times for companies to wrap their heads around from a security standpoint, because many times organizations think that those responsibilities lie with the cloud provider. And if you read your cloud provider agreements, most of the time what you'll see is they are responsible for some pieces of security, but the majority of security responsibility for cloud services, SaaS services and the like, are on the responsibility of the consumer, the consumer of the services, the organization itself. So many organizations aren't doing their due diligence around what security protocols and controls they have in place for these new systems that they either put in the cloud or they're consuming from the cloud, and that hold critical data, critical infrastructure information for their organizations. A lot there, if you go and look at the number of open RDP or vulnerable RDP servers in the world, you'll see that a lot of them exist within Amazon and Azure. And so a lot of that is misconfiguration, or once again, organizations not doing their due diligence on the security controls and the methodologies they use to provide access to that infrastructure or data in the cloud. So I wanted to provide really some practical information here as well as we get down to the end of the webinar, but things that you can look at and consider today in your environment to help protect your environment from the evil actors that are targeting organizations on a daily basis. So one of the things we always talk to clients about is making sure that you look at infection vectors or compromise vectors, places where threat actors can get a foothold, they can establish persistence within your network. We recommend turning on multi-factor authentication and using, there's many good providers out there, many good free opportunities there. We encourage you to turn that on in every case as soon as possible. In the Google world and the Microsoft world around Google services and Microsoft's Office 365 or Microsoft 365, they both offer free multi-factor authentication services within those plans that you purchase. We recommend that you do that and do it as soon as possible. The credentials for Office 365 are some of the most heavily used to exploit other services today, and we see that happening over and over and over again. Many times people have synchronized their cloud services with their on-premise Active Directory infrastructure And without multi-factor authentication turned on, threat actors from anywhere in the world can then leverage that to log into cloud services and easily pivot that into potentially gaining access to networks to deploy ransomware. Regardless, if they have the credentials where they can gain cloud services and pull data out, it can be just as devastating as a ransomware event, because once again, that data can be extorted or used to even further other operations by those threat actors. And we see that happening over and over and over and routinely out in the industry. Also, we recommend clients look at putting in the proper security tools and security tools that are monitored. So enterprise level network, email, or host-based security products that look at advanced threats. They look at user behavior. And then you also need to make sure that you've got the facilities in place, meaning your resources, skill set, the knowledge in-house to interpret that information that you get from those tools to turn that into that quick detection and remediation I mentioned before. If you can see these malicious activities happen as soon as possible, many times you can save yourself from you can reduce the impact and save yourself from the threat of ransomware being deployed, because you can isolate endpoints or block access out to specific network destinations that may be command control services for actors or other things in that way. Make sure that you do not have RDP turned on to the public internet. So if you're using RDP from home to access a work resource, talk with your IT or security team and make sure that if they are doing that, they've got protocols in place. One would be to make sure that if that happens, you're logging on with multi-factor authentication. Another would be that you put some access rules in place on your firewall so that can only occur from specific IP sources. But still, the best recommendation is to not turn on RDP over the public internet at all. And as we tell our clients, we see RDP used for illegitimate purposes internally many times, where attackers will, once they get in an environment and RDP is allowed internally, they move throughout the environment by using RDP to get to their ultimate goal, which would be the domain admin level and deploying ransomware. So even internally, if you're using RDP, protect that with multi-factor authentication, or puts group policy rules in place where only a certain group can do that, and then make sure those groups are locked down heavily. Make sure to secure your remote access methods. So if VPN is available doing whatever product you may be using as a VPN concentrator, make sure that that provider allows for multi-factor authentication, or through a single sign multi-factor authentication as well. We've seen VPNs be heavily targeted, especially those products today in today's world where vulnerabilities are released almost on a daily occurrence. You need to make sure that your remote access methods, whatever they may be, are protected and you have visibility into the attempts that are happening across that remote access. Very important, because those are ways, VPNs and RDP, that we're seeing on the rise for exploit by threat actors. Make sure you implement some best practices for your organization. Security, these issues that are coming up are really more about around the business practices and the security maturity of an organization than they are truly technical issues. Some of them most definitely are misconfigurations and technical issues, as I mentioned, but a lot of that is taken out of play if proper security protocols and security controls are put in place in the organization, where, as I said before, change management, risk management, security reviews happen on changes that occur in the environment. But also train your end users. Make sure that you have some security awareness training goes on, that they are tested or simulated with phishing attempts so they can see where the places are. They can shore up their understanding of the breaches that might occur and the methodologies that threat actors may use to compromise them. Make sure that they're using strong passwords. We see more and more passwords are becoming less and less important because users are using those things to, attackers are using different methodologies, but still, passwords should be, from a security hygiene perspective, complex and strong, and typically 15 characters or more. So make sure that your users are you're enforcing strong passwords. We hear from a lot of users that say, also make sure that your users are not reusing passwords across many environments. We hear a lot of users that say, I can't keep up with all those passwords, I can't remember all of them. There are a lot of freely available password managers out there that you can use that also are protected by multi-factor authentication. It's one thing we recommend for clients, that make sure that they're using different passwords, complex passwords, and let them use a password manager to remember those and manage those for them. There is, once again, protocols and security hygiene that you might have around the password manager, but it greatly reduces your risk if you're using different passwords on different sites. We've seen, I can't tell you the number of cases where we've seen a company call us in to help them with an incident, and a domain admin credential was harvested and used to move out the environment, and that same domain admin credentials is used on accounting, bank account websites and other critical infrastructure for the organization, and it just opens up the ability for the threat actors to inflict more and more damage on an organization. We also recommend clients really look at establishing their emergency plans. What are you going to do after hours? Walk through that process and really do a tabletop exercise, for instance, to understand. It can be does not have to be complex. It can be very simplistic. But what happens if you get an alert where an endpoint has received an alert that TrickBot's been infected on that endpoint? What are your processes around that? What do you do? Who gets called? Who gets notified? How do you determine the criticality of that? Making sure that you understand those plans ahead of time from a proactive standpoint will help you better think through the issue when you're in that place. So it's never a good time for you to start thinking through what we should do next while you're in the heat of the moment. It always adds time and complexity, and ultimately it puts the attackers in an advantage. They get the upper hand immediately when you're disorganized and not sure what your next step should be. So encourage everyone to go through that exercise as well. One of the other things you can do, OneSource provides these services as an MSSP or MDR. We kind of blur those lines. We do all those functionalities, but find some provider, an MSSP or an MDR, that can help you with those security services that maybe you don't have internally the skill set for, or the bandwidth or the resources for. There's a lot of great companies out there that can help you make sure that you're looking at the right things, and those things are monitored during those off hours or holidays, as I mentioned before, such that when an attacker tries to attempt to deploy ransomware, you get notified earlier, or your managed service provider that you work with gets notified and can take action on your behalf to reduce the impact. As we talk to clients, we always talk about it's not if, but when an attack occurs, a breach occurs. The perfect thing we can do for our clients, or the perfect outcome, is to minimize the impact of that occurrence or that compromise, such that it can be handled during a routine security incident review, and it doesn't explode into going through the process of having to worry about ransom payments, public relations, attorneys, all those sorts of things that really become detrimental and devastating to an organization when they go through those exercises. So I'll stop here and see if I have any questions. We're getting down to the bottom end of this webinar, and I don't see any questions that have been presented so far. Actually, I'm sorry, I do see one here. So the question is, can you touch on cyber insurance, as I think most business owners don't realize how it works when a breach has occurred? So that is a great point to consider. There are many companies who have cyber insurance, but I will say, in our review and working with clients, that's really a review that needs to happen with somebody who's security conscious, and not necessarily just your insurance provider, although they need to be a part of that discussion. Many times we go into clients who are affected by a breach, and there's either exclusions in the insurance policy or some specific metrics haven't been met in order for there to be a payout for the company. So we encourage companies to do their due diligence on their cyber insurance policies, make sure the coverage is appropriate and effective no matter what kind of occurrence may happen. And so once again, find a security company who deals with incident response, who can help you look at your policy and make sure it's appropriate for what it is you need in your environment. The mindset now, unfortunately, see prevailing in a lot of the industry is companies just consider that cyber insurance is all they need, and they replace good security products and tools and monitoring with cyber insurance, with the idea that if we're breached, we'll get back up. The insurance company will pay for some incident responder that they work with to come back and get us back up, and we'll be going on, and we'll be back working up as we normally would in no time. And I will say that if you talk to companies who've been through an incident, especially an incident where there's recovery that's needed, then what you see is the toll that it takes on the organization, both from a physical, a mental standpoint. Those people that are responding internally have to rebuild servers and redeploy applications and get people back up and working effectively. It takes a tremendous toll. The total amount of cost that it is levied on an organization that has a breach can't just be paid with cyber insurance. So I would encourage you to do your due diligence. Yes, you need to have cyber insurance, and it needs to be appropriate for your business. But you also, the proactive steps that you can take to try to mitigate risk ahead of time can pay off so much more when you are ahead of the game and being proactive in your approach to security. So we encourage you to do that as well. Consider those options. Great question, and appreciate that. So as mentioned before, we do have some attachments here. We do offer a free threat assessment. So if you are interested in those things, or if you're interested in services or consultation from OneSource, feel free to reach out to us. We are more than happy to help. We consider ourselves looking out for our clients. We just want our clients to be successful and try to keep them safe. We'll do anything that we can to try to help those clients. Another question just came in. I'll answer real quick since we have a few minutes left. Can you speak, this is the question, can you speak a little about any breakdown of ransomware attack vectors and where the focus might be? Applications, networks, or endpoints? So typically we see, when we think about the attack vectors, how ransomware gets in to initial compromise. Most of the time what we see that happening on is endpoints, because we're talking about phishing, or we're also talking about RDP. And as I mentioned before, having the good security controls in place so you can monitor things like endpoints. When initial attack vector is exploited, you can limit the impact to maybe that just one endpoint. That is critical. So even if RDP happens, it happens usually on that one device that RDP is open to, and if you can lock that down, then you have tremendously reduced the impact to the organization. However, I'll say that the initial vector there, although predominantly may be endpoints, we see once an attacker gets in an environment, they quickly leverage all avenues to try to laterally spread across the environment and then ultimately deploy their ransomware. So they'll use the network. So they may do things like reconnaissance on the network to try to escalate the privileges to domain admin and look for specific things like domain controllers. And then they also may look at things you have internally, like web servers that are running .NET or Java that is vulnerable, and how they can get access to those web servers. We've even seen attackers from their persistence standpoint. They'll use internal web servers to deploy web shells and other methodologies on application servers, just so they can stay and have access back to those assets within the organization. So we see a lot on the endpoint, but by all means, making sure your security controls are monitoring your applications, your networks, obviously your email as well, are all ways that proactively can help companies avoid being the victims of ransomware. So we're winding down the last 30 seconds here. I want to thank everyone once again for joining the webinar. I hope there was some valuable information that you gleaned from this. I really appreciate you taking your valuable time and once again delving into a webinar, a virtual seminar. And I know as we are all, completely overlogged with that, it's tough to sit through, but I really appreciate your time today. If you have any questions further, please reach out, let us know. We'll be happy to help you. And I hope you have a fantastic rest of your Monday. Thank you.